The mill had been sitting at the edge of Calder Creek for 11 years without turning. Everyone in the Platte River Valley knew this because the mill was visible from the Ford Road, and the Ford Road was the road everyone used, and the stillness of the wheel was the kind of thing you stopped noticing after a year or two. The way you stop noticing a fence post that has been leaning the same direction for so long that the lean has become part of your picture of the road. Nell Forsyth noticed it in September, on a morning when she had driven the wagon through the ford 3 times in the same week, because 3 different farmers had sent her to 3 different grist operations in 3 different directions, and she had spent more time on the road that week than she had spent working, which was the kind of inefficiency she found difficult to ignore once she had noticed it. She stopped the wagon at the ford on the 3rd trip and looked at the mill. The wheel was stopped. The flume was broken in 2 places. The millstone housing was intact. The building itself was standing, which was more than could be said for a lot of structures that had been abandoned for 11 years in a valley where the winters came in hard and the springs came in wet. She drove to the mill and got down and walked around it. She went inside. The upper floor was the floor where the grain came in, and the lower floor was where the dressed stone sat, and the whole mechanism that connected the water to the stone was seized and corroded, and in the condition of machinery that has been left to the weather for too long, which was a condition she had seen before, and which she understood was not the same as destroyed. Seized was not broken. Seized was stopped. There was a difference. She noted the millstone condition, which was sound, and the timber framing, which was dry-rotted in one corner and solid in the other 3, and the iron fittings on the drive shaft, which were corroded but present, and the flume, which needed significant work, but which followed a grade that was still correct, because the grade was determined by the creek, and the creek had not moved. She went back outside and looked at the wheel, which was wood and iron, and had been sitting in partial contact with the creek water for 11 years, and which was in worse condition than everything else, but which was also, she understood from looking at it, the component that determined nothing about the mill's fundamental viability, because a wheel could be rebuilt if everything it connected to was sound, and what it connected to was the drive shaft, and the stone, and the building, and those 3 things were in better condition than anyone who drove past on the Ford Road and saw the still wheel would have guessed. She drove to the county recorder's office that afternoon. The mill was owned by the estate of a man named Carver, who had died 8 years ago, and whose heirs had been paying the property tax on it ever since, without resolving the estate, which was a situation the county recorder described as not uncommon among families who disagree about the value of something nobody wants to manage. The heir of record was a nephew in the city, 2 days' ride east, who had been receiving the property tax notices and paying them from what the recorder characterized as sheer avoidance of a decision. Nell wrote the nephew's name and address in her notebook and thanked the recorder and drove home. She wrote to the nephew that evening. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first said she was interested in purchasing the Calder Creek Mill property and asked what he would take for it. The second said she could complete the transaction quickly if the price was right, which she wrote because quick completion was the thing estates wanted most, and she knew it. The nephew wrote back in 8 days and named a figure that was lower than she had expected, which told her the figure was the figure of a man who had been paying tax on something he didn't want for 8 years, and had arrived at the number by calculating what he had already paid in taxes and deciding he would accept anything above that as net positive. She offered $6 below his figure. He accepted within the week. The deed transferred in October. She paid $6 above the tax sum and owned a broken grain mill on Calder Creek. If this story finds you somewhere you didn't expect it, leave your city below. I want to know how far a thing travels when it starts with $6 and a seized drive shaft. The man she went to about the wheel was a millwright named Cass Drummond, who worked out of a town 12 miles north, and who had the particular combination of deep knowledge and minimal words that she had come to associate with people who had been doing one difficult technical thing for long enough that the difficulty had been absorbed into the body rather than remaining in the mind. He came to the mill on a Tuesday and walked the mechanism for 2 hours, while Nell followed and watched and said nothing. Because the kind of assessment Cass Drummond was performing required silence the way good bread required heat, as a fundamental condition rather than a preference. When he was done, he came to the door and stood in the October light and said, "Drive shaft is salvageable. The wheel needs full replacement. Flume is easier than it looks." He paused. "The stone is good, better than good. It's a French burr stone. Whoever put this mill in knew what he was buying." Nell had her notebook out. She wrote, "French burr stone." She said, "What does that mean for the grind quality?" Cass looked at her. He said, "It means if you get the water running and the shaft turning and the dressing correct, this mill will produce a finer grind than anything in the valley." He looked at the building. The stone is why the mill was worth building here in the first place. Most operations in this region are running composite stones. A French burr at this size is unusual. Nell wrote, "French burr, finer grind, unusual for this region." She said, "How long to make it operational?" He said, "The wheel is custom work. I'd need to build it here, which means I'm on site for 3 weeks minimum. The flume is a week with 2 men who know water work. The drive shaft and fittings are shop work I can do before I come out." He named his rate. She wrote it down. She said, "I'll need 2 men for the flume work who know what they're doing." He said, "I know 2. They work with me." She said, "What's their rate?" He told her. She did the arithmetic in her notebook in front of him, which she did not hide, and he watched her do it without comment. When she was done, she said, "I can start the work in November if you can schedule it." He said, "November is fine. The creek is low enough in November for the flume work." She said, "I'll confirm in writing." She confirmed in writing, and Cass Drummond arrived on the first Monday of November, with the rebuilt fittings in a crate, and 2 men named Wills and Greaves, who were the water workers he had mentioned, and who turned out to be brothers, compact and quiet, and in possession of a working vocabulary about creek gradients and flume design that was entirely their own, and that Nell found, over the 3 weeks of their presence, worth learning. She learned it by being present and asking 1 question per session, which was the rate she had found produced the most complete answers from people who did not naturally speak in paragraphs. The mill work took 4 weeks rather than 3, which she had privately budgeted for because she had observed that work of this kind always took longer than the estimate by a factor she had come to think of as the discovery factor, which was the fraction of every restoration job that consisted of finding things wrong that the initial assessment hadn't surfaced, because initial assessments were visual, and visual assessments could not see inside seized shafts, or behind rotted corner timbers, or beneath flume boards that looked intact from the top. The discovery in this case was the corner timber, which was worse than it had appeared on the first walkthrough, and which required replacement rather than reinforcement, adding a week to the schedule and a cost that she had partially reserved for. She did not discuss the cost overage with Cass. She absorbed it and adjusted the other numbers and said nothing, because the mill was going to work, and a week was a week, and the French burr stone was still sound, and Cass had confirmed that twice during the work, when she had asked him again, both times because she wanted to hear the confirmation against the developing cost, rather than because she doubted the stone. The wheel turned for the first time on a Thursday in late November. Nell was present when the water came into the flume and found the wheel, and the wheel began to move, slowly at first, with the deliberate acceleration of something large that has been still for a long time and is finding its balance, and then with the gathering speed of a mechanism that was working correctly. Each component doing the thing it was built to do in sequence until the drive shaft turned and the stone engaged, and the mill was running for the first time in 11 years, with a sound that Cass described afterward as clean, by which he meant that the resonance of the stone turning on its bed had the quality of machinery operating within its correct tolerances rather than fighting them. Nell stood in the lower floor and listened to the stone and said nothing. Cass stood beside her and also said nothing. The mill ran for 20 minutes while they listened to it, and then Nell went upstairs and dropped a cup of test grain into the feed and watched it come through, and caught the result in her hand, and looked at it, and handed it to Cass. He looked at it. He said, "The dressing is correct." She said, "What does the grind tell you?" He said, "It tells me the stone is what I said it was." She closed her hand around the flour. It was finer than anything she had used, a texture that was distinct from the grist operations in the valley, in the way that things are distinct when they are the result of a tool operating at the upper end of its capability rather than the middle. She wrote in her notebook that evening, November, first run, stone as Cass described, grind quality distinguishable from valley operations. She wrote one more line, "This is the product. Everything else is the operation." She drew a line under those two sentences and did not write anything else on that page. The problem she spent December on was not the mill. The mill was working. The problem was the farmers, or more precisely the farmers' habits, which were the habits of a valley that had been taking grain to 3 different grist operations in 3 different directions for a generation, and which had distributed its custom among those operations not out of preference, but out of proximity and scheduling, which was the kind of custom that was not loyal in any principled sense, but was stable in the way that inertia is stable, meaning it would continue until something changed the calculation. She needed to change the calculation. She spent December thinking about what the calculation was. The valley had 3 grist operations. All 3 ran composite stones. None of the 3 was on the Ford Road or near it, which meant every farmer using them was adding road time to the milling cost, which the farmers calculated as time, and Nell now calculated as an opportunity. The Calder Creek Mill was on the Ford Road. It was the road everyone used. The grind quality was superior to the composite stone operations. The flume and wheel were new. The question was not whether the mill was better. The question was how to make the valley's farmers understand it was better before they arrived at the conclusion on their own, which they would, eventually, but eventually was not the timeline she was working with. She went to the valley in January, not to sell, to watch. She attended the monthly meeting at the grain cooperative store, which she had learned about from Wills, one of the water workers, who was a valley farmer himself, and whose family had grown wheat on 40 acres south of the Ford for 20 years. Wills had mentioned the monthly meeting the way people mention things that are obvious to them, which was as background rather than information, and which Nell had filed as information regardless. She sat at the back of the cooperative store and listened to the farmers discuss the season's grain prices and the road conditions to the 3 grist operations and the particular complaints of the current season, which were the complaints of any grain valley in winter, which were about the cost of winter milling and the distance and the turnaround time and the quality variance between runs that meant you could not rely on consistent results from month to month. She wrote everything down. She wrote down the names of the farmers who spoke most, which were the farmers who cared most about the problem, which were the farmers who would be most useful to reach first. She wrote down the specific complaints, which were time, distance, consistency, and quality, in that order of frequency, which was useful because it told her which of her mill's advantages to lead with in any conversation. She did not introduce herself at the meeting. She drove home and looked at her notes and thought about the calculation. The calculation was this. The valley's farmers would switch to the Calder Creek Mill if the combined advantage of Ford Road proximity, superior grind quality, and consistent results exceeded the combined resistance of habit and the small social cost of changing where you took your grain, which was the cost of explaining to an established grist operator why you were no longer using him. The social cost was real. She had not expected it to be negligible, but she had observed at the meeting that the complaints about the existing operations were genuine and increasing, which meant the social cost of switching was being weighed against real dissatisfaction rather than contentment, which was a better calculation than she had hoped for in December. She started with Wills. He was the most logical first account because he had worked on the mill and had seen the stone and knew what the grind quality was and had a standing at the cooperative meeting that would make his opinion of the mill worth something to the other farmers. She asked him on a Wednesday in February if he would bring a test load to the mill before the spring planting season began. He said he would. He brought 40 pounds of winter wheat the following Saturday and stood in the lower floor while the stone ran and caught the flour himself and felt it in his hand the way Cass had felt it in November, and said, with the flat assessment of a man who does not perform reactions, "That's different from what I've been getting." Nell said, "How different?" He said, "Better different." She said, "What's the price you've been paying per bushel at the other operations?" He told her. She had already calculated her rate against that figure, and against the road time his farm lost on trips to the other operations, and against a margin that was enough to sustain the mill, but not enough to be the reason someone came. She named her rate. He looked at the flour in his hand. He said, "That's fair." She said, "I'd want to be consistent on it. Same rate, same quality, every run." He said, "That's what's missing at the other places." He brought 30 bushels the following week. He mentioned it at the cooperative meeting in March. She knew he mentioned it because 2 farmers she had not spoken to arrived at the mill the week after the March meeting and asked to see the stone and run a test batch, which she allowed without charge because the test batch was not a cost. It was the argument in its most direct form, and the argument was the stone, and the stone did not require her to explain it. Both farmers brought grain the following week. By April she had 6 accounts, which was not yet enough to put the mill at full utilization, but was enough to establish the rhythm of operation, the regular arrival of wagons and the regular processing and the regular departures with flour of a quality that the farmers were, she observed, handling differently than they handled what they brought back from the other operations, with the particular attention people pay to things they have decided are worth paying attention to. The rhythm was its own advertisement. The Ford Road went past the mill every day, and the farmers who used the Ford saw the wagons and the activity and drew the natural inference, which was that something at the Calder Creek mill was working. Cass Drummond came by in May to check the stone dressing, which he had said he would do at 6 months. He ran a test batch and looked at the result, and said the dressing was holding. He looked at the line of wagons waiting outside. He said, "You've been busy." She said, "The stone is doing the work." He said, "The stone and the road." She said, "Both." He checked the fittings on the drive shaft and found one that needed attention, and replaced it and charged her for the part and not the labor, which she wrote in the notebook as a figure and which she understood as a form of professional endorsement that she did not comment on. The summer was the test she had been anticipating since November. Summer in the Platte River Valley was when the milling operations showed what they were made of, because summer was when the grain came in volume, and when the operations that had been cutting corners on maintenance showed the consequences of the corners they had cut, and when the farmers had the most grain to move and the least patience for delays and inconsistency. The Calder Creek mill ran through the summer with the consistency of a mechanism that had been built correctly and maintained from the first day of operation. The wheel and flume handling the summer water levels within the range Wills and Greaves had designed for. The stone producing the same quality run after run because the stone was what it was, and the dressing had been done correctly, and the mechanism that drove it was in the condition of things that have been attended to, rather than operated until they failed. The other operations had a summer that Nell observed from the Ford Road and from the cooperative meetings, which she had been attending since March, and at which she was now known but not yet central, which was the position she preferred for the time being. One of the 3 other grist operations broke a composite stone in July and was out of commission for 3 weeks, while a replacement was sourced. The farmers who used that operation came to Calder Creek during the 3 weeks, which was 12 new accounts in the middle of the summer, and of the 12, 9 stayed after the stone was replaced. She did not solicit them to stay. She said nothing to them about the other operation. She ran their grain at the same rate and quality she ran everything else, and let the stone explain itself, which it did, and 9 of the 12 made their own calculation and arrived at their own conclusion without being asked to arrive at it. By the end of the first harvest season, she had 23 regular accounts in the valley. She had not yet reached full utilization of the mill, but she had established the rhythm and the reputation and the specific quality signature that the French burr stone produced, that no composite operation in the valley could replicate, and she had done it without advertising or persuasion in any form except the test batch she had run for every farmer who asked, which was the most direct form of argument and the only one she had ever found reliable. She wrote the end-of-season figures in the notebook in October, a year from the deed transfer, and looked at them against the figures she had written in November when she had done the original cost calculation. The margin was better than she had projected, partly because the summer's disruption at the other operation had produced accounts she hadn't planned for, and partly because the cost of operation was lower than estimated, which was the result of the maintenance discipline she had established from the first run, which had prevented the reactive repair costs that the other operations were absorbing as a normal part of their budgets. She wrote at the bottom of the figures page, Year 1, 23 accounts. Stone as described, operation within projected cost. She looked at what she had written and thought about the wagon on the Ford Road in September, 3 trips in 1 week, and the stillness of the wheel. She wrote one more line. The wheel was not broken, it was waiting. She closed the notebook. The second year began with the decision she had been holding since the summer, which was what to do about the capacity constraint she had identified in August, when the volume of grain coming to the mill had approached the point at which she would need to turn accounts away unless the operation could run longer hours. Running longer hours required another person on the stone, which she had thought about carefully and had arrived at specific requirements for. Someone who understood mechanism rather than just operation, who could be taught the dressing and the feed rate and the maintenance without requiring oversight of every run, and who had the patience for the specific quality of attention that the stone demanded, which was the attention of someone for whom good work was its own sufficient reason, rather than an external requirement. She found this person in March of the second year, through Wills, who mentioned his younger sister the way he mentioned everything that was obvious to him, which was as background information in a conversation about something else. Her name was Pell. She was 22 and had been managing her family's grain accounts since she was 16 and had spent more time in grist operations as a customer than most of the valley's farmers, and had opinions about the operations she had used that were precise and grounded in observation rather than preference. She came to the mill on a Friday morning and watched a full run from feed to sack and asked 4 questions, all of them about the mechanism rather than the product, which was the correct 4 questions and which told Nell what she needed to know. She said, "Come back Monday." Pell came back Monday and the week after and the week after that, and by the end of April she was running the stone independently on Tuesday and Thursday, while Nell managed the accounts and the maintenance schedule and the correspondence with the farmers about the upcoming season's volume. The correspondence was something she had started in the second year because she had noticed in the first year that the farmers who knew what they were bringing and when they were bringing it used the mill more efficiently than the ones who arrived without a plan, and that the aggregate effect of better scheduling was higher throughput at the same quality, which was the operational ideal, and which required only that the farmers agree to give her their harvest estimates in advance, which they were willing to do because it meant shorter wait times, and she had been explicit about that connection from the beginning. She wrote the scheduling letters herself, 1 per account, specific to each farmer's crop and expected harvest window, and she kept copies in the notebook and reconciled them against actual arrivals, which gave her, by the end of the second harvest season, the most complete picture of the valley's grain movement that anyone in the valley possessed. She understood this picture as infrastructure, in the same way she understood the mill as infrastructure, which was as the foundation that made everything else possible. A mill that knew what was coming, could prepare for it. A mill that was surprised by volume was a mill that made mistakes and mistakes at the stone produced inconsistent flour, and inconsistent flour was the one thing she was not going to allow the Calder Creek mill to become known for. 41 accounts by the end of the second harvest. She wrote the number in the notebook, and beside it wrote, "Valley at approximately half capacity." She had estimated the valley's full grain production against the mill's theoretical throughput in March, and the result was that at full utilization, the mill could process the valley's entire harvest output with capacity to spare, which meant the growth ceiling was not the mill, but the valley, and the valley was not going to grow fast enough to reach the ceiling in the foreseeable future, which meant the question was whether to remain a valley mill or to become something larger. She wrote that question on a new page in November of the second year and left it there and thought about it through the winter, the way she thought about all large questions, which was by doing the other work first and letting the large questions settle in the background until it resolved itself into something she could act on. The resolution came in February of the third year, not from thinking but from a conversation with a man named Harston, who ran a provisioning supply for several of the valley's merchants, and who had been a regular presence at the cooperative meetings, and who had begun, in the second year, to talk to Nell at those meetings about things that were adjacent to the mill, and that were, she understood, his way of establishing whether there was a commercial relationship worth pursuing. He said in February, at the cooperative meeting after the formal business was done, "The flour from your mill. I have a merchant in the Eastern Settlement who's been asking about sourcing specialty flour. He's been bringing it up from the city at significant cost. He's looking for a regional supplier." She had her notebook. She said, "What does he mean by specialty?" Harston said, "Finer grind than standard. Consistent from batch to batch. The city supply is inconsistent," she wrote. Harston, Eastern Settlement merchant, specialty flour, fine grind, consistency. She said, "Tell me the merchant's name and I'll write to him directly." Harston gave her the name. She wrote to the merchant that week, a letter that described the mill's stone and grind quality and current production volume in the same plain terms she used to describe everything she understood well, and which included a sample of the previous month's flour, packed in a cloth bag and sealed with wax, which she sent not as theater, but as the most efficient form of argument she knew, which was the thing itself, rather than the description of the thing. The merchant wrote back in 10 days. He wanted 200 pounds per month, consistent grade, delivered to the Ford Road Junction where Harston's supply wagon ran east on the first Monday of every month. Nell did the arithmetic. 200 pounds per month was within current production capacity if she and Pell both ran full days twice a week, which was a workable schedule and which she confirmed with Pell before she wrote back to the merchant. She wrote back the following week with terms and a delivery confirmation. The merchant accepted by return post. She wrote in the notebook, "Third year, Eastern merchant account, 200 pounds monthly, specialty designation." She looked at the word specialty and thought about Cass Drummond in November of the first year, standing in the lower floor of the mill, while the wheel turned for the first time, saying the stone is what I said it was, and the flour in her hand that was finer than anything in the valley, and that she had identified that day as the product, which was the thing that everything else was the operation around. The stone had been there all along, sitting still at the bottom of a broken mill that everyone drove past on the Ford Road without stopping, because the wheel was still, and the flume was broken, and the owner was in the city paying tax on something he didn't want, and nobody had thought to walk inside and look at the stone, which was French burr and unusual for the region, and better than anything within 50 miles, waiting to be understood the way all useful things wait, which is without complaint and without announcement, doing nothing until someone with the correct kind of attention comes along and asks what it is for. The third harvest season was the one the valley remembered. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the accumulation of 2 years of consistent quality and reliable scheduling, and the word of mouth that moves through a farming community the way water moves through a watershed, finding the lowest path and filling it completely, had reached the point at which the Calder Creek Mill was no longer a new operation, that some farmers were trying, but the operation that the valley's grain came to first. She understood this had happened in August of the third year when the cooperative meeting's discussion of milling arrangements, which had always involved a three-way conversation about the valley's three options, had become a two-way conversation about the valley's one primary option and the question of what to do when the primary option was at capacity. The capacity discussion was the clearest indication of where things stood, because you do not discuss the capacity of an operation that people are ambivalent about. You discuss the capacity of an operation that people have decided they need. She had been managing the capacity question since June. The scheduling system she had built in the second year was producing the information she needed to see the constraint before it became visible as a weight line, which was the form in which it would have been most damaging, because a weight line at a grist mill was not a sign of success in the minds of the farmers who were standing in it. It was an obstacle, and obstacles were what sent people back to the operations they had left. She had decided before the third harvest began that she would not have a weight line. The way she achieved this was not by turning accounts away, which she could not afford to do in the third year when the Eastern Merchant account was drawing on production volume, but by extending the operating days, which she did by hiring a second assistant miller in July, a man named Cord, who had worked at one of the other valley operations for 7 years, and who came to her when that operation's stone broke again, and whose knowledge of grist work was solid, and whose knowledge of the French burr stone specifically was, she discovered in the first week, better than she had expected from someone who had worked composite stones his whole career, because Cord had the quality she had been looking for in Pell, which was the quality of someone who paid attention to why a thing worked, rather than only to what the procedure was. Cord ran Mondays and Wednesdays alongside Pell's Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Nell managed the Friday and Saturday runs herself, along with the accounts and the maintenance oversight and the correspondence, which by August was substantial enough that she had begun writing the monthly scheduling letters with a form she had developed over 2 years that allowed her to complete 12 letters in the time it had previously taken her to complete 4, which was the kind of efficiency gain that happened when you did the same thing enough times to understand what the essential information was and what the surrounding language was. The Eastern Merchant increased his order in August. He had been selling the flour through his merchant operation and had found that it was producing customer interest that he had not anticipated, which was the phrase he used in his letter, and which Nell understood as the same thing that had happened in the valley, which was that the stone spoke for itself when people tasted what it produced, and that the speaking accumulated into reputation faster than advertising would have reached. She accommodated the increased order by adding a Tuesday afternoon run to the schedule and confirming the revised volume in writing. She also raised her rate by a small amount, not an aggressive amount, an amount that reflected the demand the Eastern account was demonstrating and that Pell had suggested in a conversation about the scheduling numbers that had been, in Nell's experience of hiring people, the kind of suggestion that told you something important about the person making it, which was that they understood the relationship between demand and value and were comfortable stating it, which was not a common quality, and which she filed as worth paying attention to for other reasons than the rate discussion. 49 accounts by the end of the third harvest. The Eastern Merchant, supplying 3 additional merchants he had introduced to the flour in August. Cord on full-time from September, when the harvest volume made part-time insufficient. The mill at the Calder Creek Ford running 6 days a week with 3 people who knew what they were doing, and 1 French burr stone that was performing the way French burr stones perform when they are correctly driven and properly dressed, which was at the upper end of what stone milling could produce, and in the way that Cass Drummond had described in October of the first year, with a fineness and consistency that the composite operations in the valley were not in a position to match, regardless of how they managed their equipment, because the equipment was the difference, and the equipment was stone. She wrote the third harvest numbers in October and looked at them for a long time. The margin had grown in each of the 3 years, not dramatically but consistently, in the way that margins grow when costs are controlled, and quality is maintained, and volume increases without requiring proportional increases in overhead, which was the operational structure she had been trying to build since the first run, and which the third year confirmed was working. She wrote, 3 years, 49 Valley accounts, Eastern Merchant Network expanding, operation profitable. She set the pen down and looked at the notebook, which was on its second volume now, the first volume sitting on the shelf where she could reach it when she needed to refer to the first year's numbers, which she did occasionally to check her original projections against outcomes, not out of sentiment, but because the comparison between what she had projected and what had actually happened was one of the most reliable sources of information she had about how well she understood the things she was working with. The projections had been conservative on volume and accurate on quality, and slightly optimistic on timeline, which told her that her understanding of the stone had been precise from the beginning, and her understanding of how long it took farmers to change their habits had been slightly underestimated, which was a correction she had incorporated into how she thought about the fourth year and what it would require. The fourth year was going to require a decision she had been approaching since the February conversation with Harston about the Eastern Merchant. The decision was scale. The Eastern Merchant Network was now 4 merchants and growing, and the volume they collectively wanted was approaching the point at which the mill at Calder Creek could not supply it without taking capacity from the Valley accounts, which she was not willing to do, because the Valley was where the operation had been built, and the Valley farmers were the relationships that had made everything else possible, and she did not intend to reduce their access to the mill in order to supply merchants they had never heard of. Which meant if the Eastern Network was going to grow, the supply for it needed to come from a second operation. She had been thinking about what a second operation meant since August. It did not mean a second mill she owned and operated, which would require capital she would need to seek, and time she did not have. It meant something she had not previously considered, which was a partnership with an existing mill in the Eastern Territory that could supply the merchant network's volume under the quality standard the Calder Creek stone produced, which required finding a mill with a stone that met the standard, and finding the person operating it who understood the stone the way she understood hers. She wrote to Cass Drummond in November. She asked if he knew of mills in the Eastern Territory with French burr stones. He wrote back in 2 weeks. He knew of 2. One was operating, one was not. He gave her the locations and what he knew of the operators, and said if she went to see either of them, she should give his name, which he offered without being asked, and which she understood as the second professional endorsement he had given her, the first having been the drive shaft fitting he had replaced at no labor charge in May of the first year. She went to see the operating mill in December, a 2-day ride east on the road that connected the Platte River Valley to the eastern settlements, the same road that Harston's supply wagon ran. The mill was on a tributary creek, and the wheel was turning, and the stone was French burr, and the operator was a man named Gale, who had been running the mill for 12 years, and who received her with the cautious directness of a man who had been operating alone long enough to have developed a complete suspicion of anything that arrived from outside his usual radius. She gave him Cass Drummond's name. His expression changed, not dramatically, not to warmth exactly, but to the recalibrated attention of someone who has received a reference they trust and is revising their initial assessment accordingly. She described what she had in mind. He listened. He said, "You want to supply Eastern merchants from my operation under your quality standard." She said, "Under the quality standard the stone produces when it's dressed correctly and driven at the right rate. I want to confirm the current dressing and rate before I commit to any volume with the merchants." He said, "You want to check my work." She said, "I want to know what the stone is doing so I can tell the merchants accurately what they're getting." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Come back tomorrow. I'll run a batch at dawn, when the water is coldest. That's when the stone is at its best." She came back at dawn. She watched the run and caught the flour herself and felt it in her hand, and the quality was what she had hoped it would be, which was comparable to the Calder Creek stone and distinguishable from the composite operations by the same fineness and density that the French burr always produced when it was running correctly. She said, "This is what I'd tell the merchants they're getting." He said, "Then we're talking about the same product." They talked for another hour about volume and rate and delivery logistics and the relationship between the two operations, which Nell described as a supply partnership rather than a subordination. Because Gale's 12 years and his stone and his operation were not subordinate to anything, and she did not intend to present them as such, and which Gale received with the slight relaxation of a man who has been waiting to hear whether he is being respected or managed, and has just heard the answer. They signed nothing that day. She said she would write the terms and send them. He said he would read them. She rode back to the Platte River Valley on a December afternoon with the Eastern Territory behind her and the mill at Calder Creek ahead, the Ford Road coming up familiar under the horse's feet. And she thought about September 3 years ago, when she had driven this road 3 times in 1 week, and stopped at the ford and looked at the still wheel and understood that the stillness was a problem with the water and not with the stone, and that the stone was what mattered, and that the stone was worth $6 and everything after. The terms went to Gale in January. He accepted 4 of the 6 and proposed revisions on 2 that she reviewed and accepted because they were correct revisions, the kind that improved the terms rather than weakening them, and which told her something about Gale that confirmed what the Dawn Run had told her, which was that he understood what he was doing at a level that made him worth building something with. The partnership was formalized in February. She wrote the date in the notebook and beside it wrote, "Second Stone, Eastern Supply, network complete for current merchant volume." She looked at what she had written and thought about what complete meant, which was not finished but sufficient, the point at which the structure supported the load it was carrying without strain, which was not the end of building but the confirmation that the foundation was right. Outside, the February light was flat and cold over the Calder Creek Ford, the same light that had been flat and cold over the ford every February for as long as anyone in the valley could remember, and the wheel at the Calder Creek mill was turning in it, steady and unhurried, doing the work that water and stone and the correct kind of attention had been building toward since the first Thursday in November 3 years ago, when it had turned for the first time in 11 years and produced a sound that Cass Drummond called clean. It was still clean. It turned every day and produced what it had always been capable of producing, the fine, consistent flour of a French burr stone running at its correct rate on a wheel that was new, and a shaft that was maintained, and in a building that had been repaired, and was now the building that the valley's grain came to first, because the valley had learned what Nell had known on the day she walked inside and looked at the stone, which was that the mill was not broken. The mill had never been broken. The wheel had been still, and the flume had been broken, and the shaft had been seized, and the building had been weathered, but the stone had been sound, and the stone was the thing, and everything else was the work of getting the stone what it needed, to do what it had always been capable of doing, which was to take what the land grew and make it into something finer than the land had offered, which was the oldest purpose of a mill, and the only purpose that had ever mattered. The summer of the 4th year brought the thing she had not anticipated, which was not a problem but a validation of a different kind than she had experienced before. A man came to the mill in July, not a farmer and not a merchant, a man from the Territorial Agricultural Board who had been sent to survey the valley's milling operations as part of a broader assessment of grain infrastructure across the region. He had a ledger and a set of standardized questions, and the slightly distracted manner of someone conducting a survey he had conducted in many places and expects to produce unremarkable results. He came to the Calder Creek mill because it was on his list, and walked through the building and asked his questions and watched Pell run a batch and wrote in his ledger. Then he stopped writing and looked at the flour in the sample bag he had collected and said, "What is the stone?" She said, "French burr, original installation." He looked up from his ledger. He said, "This operation has been running for 3 years." She said, 4th year currently. He looked at the sample bag and then at her, and then at the wheel visible through the door turning in the July water. He said, "The other operations in the valley, what stone are they running?" She said, "Composite, all 3. He wrote something in his ledger. He said, "I've surveyed 41 milling operations in this territory over the past 2 years. I've found 4 French burr stones." He paused. "2 of them are not operational." She said, "I know of a 3rd that's operational. Eastern Territory, Gale's operation on the tributary creek." He wrote the name. He said, "You know of it because," she said, "because we have a supply partnership." He looked up again. He looked at her with the expression of the survey man who has arrived at something his survey did not have a category for and is deciding whether to create one. He said, "A supply partnership between 2 French burr operations." She said, "For the Eastern merchant accounts. The valley accounts are supplied from this stone." He wrote in his ledger for a while. Then he said, "I'd like to come back in the fall. The board is developing recommendations for regional grain infrastructure investment. An operation of this quality and structure is relevant to those recommendations." She said, "Come when you need to." He came in October with 2 other men from the board, and they spent 2 days at the mill and 2 days at Gale's operation, and produced a report that she did not see until January, when Harston brought a copy to the cooperative meeting and read a section of it aloud, which described the Calder Creek Mill as the highest quality grist operation in the territory, and the supply partnership with the Eastern operation as a model for regional grain infrastructure development. The cooperative meeting was quiet for a moment when Harston finished reading. Then Wills, who was sitting 3 rows back, said, "We knew that," which was not quite accurate, because what the valley had known was that the flour was better and the mill was reliable and the scheduling system worked, and what the report was saying was that those things, taken together and set against the territory's grain infrastructure as a whole, were unusual enough to be described as a model. The distinction mattered to Nell, who was sitting at the back of the meeting as she always sat, with her notebook. She wrote, "Board report, model designation." She wrote it and thought about what model meant, which was not a destination, but a description, the description of a thing that had been built correctly enough that other people could learn from it, which was a different kind of outcome than the accounts and the merchant network and the partnership with Gale, not better or more important, but different, in the way that things are different when they go from being the product of private work to being the evidence of something that could be understood by people who had not done the work. She drove home on the October road in the late afternoon light, the Ford beneath the wheels of the wagon, the mill wheel turning in the creek as she passed, steady and unhurried and clean. And she thought about the September morning when she had stopped at this Ford and looked at the still wheel and understood what she was looking at, which was not a broken mill, but a question. The question was, what is this for? She had answered it. She had been answering it for 4 years, one run at a time, one account at a time, one correctly scheduled letter, and one properly dressed stone, and one $6 decision that everyone who drove past on the Ford Road had also driven past without stopping, because stopping required a specific kind of attention that most people were not in the habit of paying, and that she had been in the habit of paying since she could remember, which was the habit of looking at still things and asking what they were waiting for. She went home and opened the notebook and wrote the day's entries, and then wrote, at the bottom of the page, in the same small level hand she had been writing in since the 1st November. The stone was always there. The stone is still there. Tomorrow the stone will still be there. She closed the notebook. Outside, the October dark came down over the Platte River Valley and the Calder Creek Ford and the mill where the wheel had turned every day for 4 years, and where Pell would come in the morning and Cord would come at midday, and the farmers would bring their wagons, and the flour would come out the way it had always come out, fine and consistent, and the product of a stone that had been sitting in a seized and weathered and abandoned mill for 11 years, waiting in the particular patience of good tools that have not been understood yet, for someone to stop on the road and ask what it was worth.